morning, everybody, and welcome today to this very special online version of the Australian Association Environmental Educators National Conference, Manjugadup Changing Tides. It's great to be with you all today. It would have been wonderful to be over there in sunny Mandurah, Western Australia, but due to the challenges forced on us by COVID-19, of course, we won't be able to be together in person until next year, which I'm sure many of us will be very gleeful to be on a plane to Western Australia, especially those of us in Victoria. In the meantime, of course, Dr. Jennifer Pearson and the team from the Western Australian A2E2 chapter have fantastically put together this brilliant one-day online conference for us. And it's just great to have people from all over Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world joining what is in many ways an international conference. My name is Grant Fenton. I'm the Executive Officer for the Victorian chapter of the Australian Association Environment Educators, Environment Education Victoria, and it's my honour to be your Master of Ceremonies today. And while I've emceed a lot of conferences before, I've never done one where I've sat on my bum in my shed. So this is a brand new thing for me to do, and I hope you'll be patient with me as we go through this process today. I hope you have a fantastic day. We've got some terrific presenters, and it'll be great to remove ourselves from the outside world, forget about USA presidential debates and COVID-19 for the moment, and focus on the things that are really important to us as we represent environmental educators across our country. Our first speaker, Dr. Jennifer Pearson, is the President of the Australian Association of Environment Educators. Jennifer has had an extensive career in teaching from pre-primary through to university, pre-service, primary and early childhood. As a primary teacher, she specialised in science education and then in secondary teaching design and technology. In tertiary setting, Jennifer was also at work as a lecturer in primary, early childhood science and technology and enterprise. As the current president of the Australian Association for Environment Education, she's been at 2010 to 2014 and again 2018 until now. She's also been the convener of the AAEE WA chapter since 2002, and she was the chair of Little Green Steps WA program, currently still is, I think, doing that, where she's developed a unique sustainability program for early years educators. She participated in the Ministerial Steering Committee in 2003 to 2006 to oversee the implementation of the Aussie Schools program in Western Australia. She's been on the Millennium Kids Board from 2004 to 2008 to support the development of youth programs, and she's a member of the Science Teachers Association of WA from 2004 to 2008. She's worked since 2003 developing and collaborating an Earth Day Expo, which still continues on to today. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today from the National President of A2E2, Dr. Jennifer Pearson.
Hiya Bullock. The Australian Association of Environmental Education acknowledges and pays respect to the Binjar people, who are the traditional owners and the first peoples of this land. We pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledging the continued contribution they make to the life of this city of Mandurah and this region. Welcome to the A2E2 virtual conference in 2020, which comes in a year that has been challenging for many reasons. The planning for this conference was referenced to the adaptive cycle to focus us on the natural order of systems. Many of you involved in ecosystems understand this well. The cyclic shifting of energy moves through phases that have been identified as, and in no particular order, growth or exploration, conservation, collapse or release, and then reorganisation. The adaptive cycles are nested in a hierarchy across time and space, with the potential for novel recombinations to be retested as this loops through those phases. We are in the collapse or release phase as a result of the COVID pandemic, with the letting go of what is familiar in our ways of being and working in our different sectors. Many have now had an embedded learning experience of change, as they have to adapt to situations out of their immediate control. And it has presented great opportunities to step out of the patterns of their life. For many, the urge to return to life as normal is now a catch cry as they grapple with uncomfortable situations and perceived threats to their well-being. This unravelling is a pivotal moment, bringing into stark reality many of the issues that we have consistently raised with all levels of government, in our various workplaces and in our personal lives. A2 continues to advocate to support teachers and environmental educators to escalate the demonstrated positive outcomes being achieved in our schools and communities. We are looking to increase our networking opportunities, confirm and consolidate our partnerships. The increase in collaborative projects and subsequent evaluation is building a considerable narrative of all of your endeavours, which need to be communicated effectively to continue to lead the changes that are required. We have an informed, articulate, and passionate youth movement in Australia who are mobilising to make sure that those who are able to make the necessary decisions are doing it for the right reasons. Those that have gone before are looping in and around their call for change to the normal way of living. We urge everybody to continue to walk alongside the next generation to sustain them in their work. This conference is indeed a result of A2 reorganising how we connect and deliver to our members and others. It has required us to seek out knowledge, to learn different strategies, different partners, and Michael is now on my Christmas list because he's the IT man, different ways of working, but it has enabled us to increase our reach across this country and beyond. Our international partners in North America, Japan and New Zealand have greater access in a time when all of us are digging deep to activate our resilience. Thank you sincerely to all the presenters for making time to provide their presentations to inspire and inform us on their journey. We know that the delegates will indeed hear what they need to hear to move their journey of resilience in the right direction. Thank you to all the delegates for preparing to listen deeply to these sessions. We trust that you will be troubled, enlightened, and inspired to look within and connect to what is necessary for you to become what is needed, to use this release and reorganisation phase to improve the existence of all the species on this blue planet. We hope that you have a wonderful day and we look forward to hearing what's changed for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for your patience there, ladies and gentlemen, as we got that technical bit right. And it's always challenging when that happens, but you handled it like a professional, Jennifer, so thanks very much. And you get to now sit back and enjoy the rest of this fabulous conference. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Glenroy in sunny, windy, rainy Melbourne, where the weather changes every couple of minutes. And there are people from all over Australia and all over the world joining us today. It's very exciting to have people from everywhere. So my pleasure to see you all here today with us. Our opening keynote speaker, Professor Marianne Krasny, is in the Department of Natural Resources and Director of the Civic Ecology Lab at Cornell University. And I have to say, from reading her bio, she's written more books than I've ever read. So I won't list them all here today, but they are, of course, online for you to reference. Marianne leads efforts to teach environmental and climate education, massive open online courses, or MOOCs, for international audiences, and to facilitate online learning and resource sharing communities for over 10,000 environmental activists and educators globally. That's quite a number. Dr. Krasny was Director of EPA's National Environment Education Training Program and of the Garden Mosaics Community Gardening Education Program, and is a Public Voices Fellow and International Fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry. Dr. Krasny conducts research with members of the Civic Ecology Lab to answer questions about how to scale up the impacts of civic ecology practices such as community gardening, litter cleanups and volunteer oyster restoration, and about how online learning can lead to more effective environmental education and stewardship practices and climate actions. She's currently working on another book about scaling up individual climate action such as plant-rich diet through social networks and activism. And it's our absolute great pleasure to have her here today as our keynote speaker, opening our conference. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marianne Krasny.
Thank you, Grant. I think the trick is that I never read any books, so, but no, thank you for that really kind introduction. And excuse me, it's really exciting to talk to you today from Ithaca, New York. Actually, I don't know if you can see, that's my window there. So it is nighttime here. And it's kind of exciting just to be able to talk to you from so far, so many, continent and maybe several continents, depending on where you are, and ocean. So anyway, it's a great pleasure. So I wanted to start today by talking about a little bit of different discipline than environmental education. In the 1980s, it became very clear that we were facing a biodiversity crisis, threatened with extinction of many, many species. And so a group of biologists, they got together and they formed a new discipline called conservation biology. So prominent amongst these was, and I don't really see this clearly, so if there's any problem, just stop me and tell me, but I'll assume that everything's okay. So prominent among these scientists was Michael Soule, and he wrote an article in Bioscience in 1985 that was called, "What is Conservation Biology? A new synthetic discipline addresses the dynamics and problems of perturbed species, communities, and ecosystems." He also talked about conservation biology as a crisis discipline. So just a little bit of background. Up to 1/2 of the Earth's biodiversity will be lost in the next several decades. We don't have time to collect all the relevant information for all these species. Making a decision to recommend further study or research is a decision that we should be aware of. It is a decision that effectively says, if there is a problem, like a biodiversity extinction problem, that we can still correct it later. So he's kind of saying that, if we say we need more research, then we're sort of saying that we're not in a crisis right now. Soule went on to talk about conservation biology being to biology as surgery is to physiology and war is to political science. So again, emphasizing the crisis nature of conservation biology as a discipline. And then in 2007, Robert Cox had an article where he talked about, is environmental communication another discipline that we can describe as a crisis discipline? And he defined crisis discipline as a field that integrates research with ethical considerations that address critical societal issues. And they went on to say, in crisis disciplines, one must act before knowing all the facts. So I don't know if there's a chat here for this conference, but I thought we might take a minute and just sort of, if you do have a chat, then write in, what do you believe? Is environmental education a crisis discipline? Yes or no? Oops, the X is supposed to say disagree there. Sorry, something got cut off. So it's agree, disagree. Okay, I'm not sure. Let me see if I can, yeah. I don't really see a chat, so I'm just gonna go ahead. I'm not sure if you all are able to chat, but I'll just go ahead and tell you what I believe. Maybe you're not surprised. My position is that environmental education is a crisis discipline. We not only have that extinction crisis that I mentioned earlier, but also water crises, and of course the climate crisis, or as some people call it, climate catastrophe. So I think looking at EE as a crisis discipline provides an alternative to the focus on knowledge leads to behavior. So the kind of knowledge, attitudes, behavior paradigm that a lot of us work in, and I know sometimes I still do, even though there's been a lot written about this, is not really a very valid theory of change to base our programs on. So I think looking at E as a crisis discipline also allows us to focus on systems change. So we're going to I'll be talking about this as opposed to sort of more a narrow focus on knowledge to behavior change. And three ideas or constructs that were, two of which were mentioned earlier by Jennifer, resilience and adaptive cycle, as well as panarchy, which I'll be explaining today, can translate environmental education as a crisis discipline to environmental education as practice. So I'm going to talk about resilience first, so I'll talk about these three in order. So there's lots of different kinds of resilience. It's a word that a lot of people are using now. And we can talk about psychological resilience that I think is very important in our work, especially working with young people. And it refers to the capacity for positive adaptation following adverse experiences that could disrupt or destroy a person's successful functioning or development. So we can talk about ecological resilience, and much of the work in ecological resilience was done in the 1970s by Buzz Holling, and he was working in the spruce fir forests of Eastern Canada. And while he was working there, there was a devastating infestation of the spruce budworm. And so he kind of started thinking about resilience in terms of ecosystems or this forest system, and he defined resilience as the magnitude of disturbance that a system can experience before it moves into a different state with different controls on structure and function. So in terms of the spruce fir forest, what he's thinking about is, are enough trees going to be killed by this insect so that instead of this beautiful spruce fir forest, what we're going to end up with is some sort of totally different system, like maybe so many trees are dead that it becomes some sort of shrubby or other kind of system. And then Carl Folke from the Stockholm Resilience Center, with a long list of authors in 2002, had a paper on ecological resilience. And I think they also talked about social ecological resilience, which I'll address in a moment in that paper. But he talked about that ecological resistance emphasizes the possibility of a system to adapt to change and to recover or reorganize after disturbances. So I think the fact that a lot of what we talk about today in social ecological systems resilience stems from this original work by Holling is important, because there's always been this sort of critique, debate in resilience. Is it really about kind of adapting and keeping what we have intact as much as we can? Or is it about transforming to something new, reorganization? And I think a lot of this original adaptation, or as Holling says, maintain, the system, not so that it doesn't move into a different state. It has to do potentially, I was just thinking this as I was preparing this talk, the fact that he worked in a beautiful spruce fir forest. And when we work in these more or less natural systems, we become really attached to them. And the worst thing we want to happen is that there's an insect infestation, a fire, a flood that destroys them. But when we talk about social resilience or community resilience, we often talk about transformation, right? We're often talking about, oh, we want something better. And I think this is at the core of some critiques of the concept of resilience that I'll talk about in a moment. It's like, are we talking about stasis, or are we talking about change and transformation? So social ecological system resilience, which is really what the Stockholm Resilience Center focuses on in the Resilience Alliance website, is the capacity of a social ecological system to tolerate disturbance without collapsing and to rebuild or transform when necessary. So again, you see this kind of pull and push between tolerating disturbance without collapsing and then rebuilding or even maybe transforming into something better. So this slide is actually of a little piece of shoreline in Korea. And there was a Typhoon Rusa that passed through here. It destroyed some buildings along the shoreline there. And then the people here are planting trees. So they're actually creating a new system after the original, not the original, but the previous system, which was a built environment, has collapsed. So, my take on this is they're actually transforming it maybe to something better. Okay, so there's been a lot of critiques of social ecological systems resilience, and I'll just go through them quickly. First is that definitions vary. I've talked about that a little bit. And so it's not really clear what we're talking about. And I think this is the second one is a really important critique, that the whole kind of social ecological resilience thinking was developed for the natural sciences. I mentioned Buzz Halling and that work in that spruce fir forest in Canada, but it's been applied to the social sciences. So this doesn't really go over always so well with social scientists. And some of the things that social scientists might claim it ignores is things like agency, conflict, knowledge, and power. And there's even been claims of sort of the scientific imperialism. There's a recognition that we need to work across disciplines, across the social sciences and the ecological sciences. But instead of just sort of making the ecological sciences dominant and taking all the constructs that were developed in that spruce fir forest and applying it to social sciences, maybe pluralism, like recognizing each discipline as its own, would be preferred. So another critique is that, and I'm guilty of this, and you'll see this later on, I'll just be upfront about it, is that we consider resilience as an inherently positive attribute. So we're not really, it's like a goal for what we want to get to, kind of like sustainability. And then the last one I have here sort of repeats above, but it's from a paper by Hela Latsasitka and Arjen Valls, and I thought you might know those two very prominent environmental education scholars from South Africa and the Netherlands. And their critique is that social ecological systems resilience focuses on adaptation and return to the pre-existing state rather than on needed transformation. So we've kind of talked about that already, but their paper is specifically environmental related and might be of interest. Okay, so I'm going to switch from resilience to the adaptive cycle. So I don't know if they still teach this in school, but definitely when I went to school, we learned about succession, right? So you learned about, there might be a glacier retreating or a volcano, and you have this bare surface, and you first get these early successional pioneer plants, annual plants, and then you go through all these stages till you get to this climax forest, right? And it was sort of a one-directional, and then the hardwood forest was kind of expected to stay there kind of forever. But what the adaptive cycle people started thinking about is that, well, these fires, whatever disturbance, floods, they're kind of a natural part of the system. And so what we should really be thinking about is more of a cycle rather than just this one way, building up to the climax forest. So you're going to have this growth and then conservation, which is what we used to call the climax forest. Then you might have some big disturbance of fire. You have this release of all this energy coming out of the trees that are burning. And then you have some sort of reorganization and the cycle repeats itself. Maybe not, obviously not exactly the same as before. Okay, so I just wanted to apply this to a social ecological system. And so I'll just go through the different stages the way I see them. So this is New York City, and you can imagine New York, if you can imagine that far back, in the late 1990s. And it was doing really well financially. There are a lot of resources there. It was fairly stable period. So I think of it as sort of the climax of the conservation phase. And there might be little disturbances, like, you get a heavy rainfall, so maybe you install some sort of green infrastructure to try and absorb the water, but you're really talking about adaptation and maintaining that well-functioning system. But then you could get a major disturbance. We had 9/11, or think about New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. And at this point, we had this release of energy. It's kind of like we've reached a tipping point. And so you have a change potentially into a totally different system. Like in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of people talking about that, you know, this is the end, the city will never come back. People shouldn't even live here in the first place. And so there was this idea that there's just, you know, maybe it's going to go back to sort of a flooded wetland or whatever. However, the city came back, and I like to make the case that one of the things that can help these cities reorganize or come back, or any system, is what we call specific ecology practices, essentially grassroots environmental stewardship, so community tree planting. But I like to think of these as being very similar, or at least have possibilities for environmental education programs or environmental learning. So, for example, you know, these practices, they're helping to restore green spaces, maybe even green spaces where they weren't green spaces before. So there's some sort of transformation, but there's also the social capital, the learning about trees, about systems, about other people in your neighborhood that can go along with these. And so that's why there's this opportunity there for environmental learning or environmental education. And we see a lot of these kinds of practices after disturbance in the US. So after 9/11, for example, people sort of spontaneously would plant these little gardens, memorial gardens. And again, it's an opportunity potentially for environmental learning. And I like to think of the right-hand part of the slide as being adaptation. So here, before that tipping point, we're just trying to, you know, keep that original system intact. But there are these opportunities for transformation too. And we see this with COVID. So I would imagine in Australia it's similar, but for example, in New York and even in Ithaca, where I live, they're closing off streets to cars so that people can, you know, the restaurants can put their tables out on the street and people can enjoy eating at least while it's still warm here. And, you know, the possibility is that this will really transform New York or maybe even Ithaca in some positive ways, right? There'll be more pedestrian space, less space for cars. All right. So the last concept I wanted to talk about is panarchy. And here the idea is that we can have adaptive, I think Jennifer mentioned this also. She mentioned, I think, over time and space. And so here the idea is, this is really over scale as I think about it, but I guess it's both spatial scale and temporal scale. So you can have these adaptive cycles, and they can be sort of small cycles that occur very quickly, as well as large and slow cycles. So I'm going to again give some illustrations of this. So if we think about the small and fast cycle, and again, I think there's opportunities for environmental learning here. So let's just say that in New York, again, we have some oyster restoration projects, right? So people are trying to restore some natural features of the shoreline and, you know, to prevent against flooding, storm surges, but also to restore the oyster population. So we're creating some really nice green infrastructure. And again, you might have youth groups involved with this. We had the Billion Oysters Project in New York City to do some oyster restoration, and there's lots and lots of schools and youth groups that are involved in this. Okay, so then at the next level, you might have a whole neighborhood that is actually being built with a lot of green infrastructure. And then here they have plans for the south end of Manhattan, Battery Park, if you've been there, to have all kinds of green infrastructure, again, to sort of protect against storm surge, but also to offer amenities for the humans that are there. All right, so again, if there was a chat, we could do this in the chat, but I just wanted you to think about, like, where does the term panarchy come from? This term that's used to describe these processes. And actually, while you're thinking about that, I forgot one thing, so I'm going to go back to this previous slide. So you notice that there's the revolt arrow and the remember arrow. So what this is about is the idea of revolt and remember is that the processes occurring at different scales can impact each other. So revolt refers to, let's just say there's lots and lots of these little oyster restoration projects, and there's lots of education, environmental learning going on. Well, that might sort of push the system up to the next level and make developers more likely to include these kinds of projects in the design of new communities. We also have the remembrance arrow that's pointing down, and this has to do with constraints on the system. So at higher levels, you're going to have what we call some sorts of memories. So let's think about the oysters again. So what if instead of the oyster populations being decimated in New York City, the oysters had gone extinct, and we had no longer any oysters that we could use to reproduce new oysters. So therefore, the biological memory of oysters has been destroyed, and that can impact what the possibilities are for restoration activities at these smaller scales. And you can think of other kinds of constraints that come from a higher level, like, does your city even allow this kind of activity? All right, so I'm going to go. I asked you about where the name comes from, and you might have thought about the part of the name that's archy, so hierarchy. But there's also the part that's Pan, and Pan was actually a Greek god, half goat, half man, and he wandered around the Greek peninsula and islands, and he destroyed and created. He aroused panic, and he would even transform nymphs who attempted to flee into stationary objects. So Pan is this idea. He represents this sort of destruction, like disturbance, and creation or transformation, reorganization. And that's why Holling and Gunderson, who wrote about panarchy, they decided to make this new word that combines pan and hierarchy. I think that's just kind of a fun little thing to think about. All right, so in terms of EE, we have, just to summarize, we have these phases of destruction and reorganization or transformation that allow for new practices and innovations, and this can occur at multiple scales. So I just want to apply this in the last few minutes, about 5 more minutes, I think, to EE practice. So I mentioned earlier that I'm just going to take for granted that resilient ecological systems are a positive, something we want to work for. And Walker and Salt wrote a book called Resilience Thinking, where they defined or they identified a bunch of attributes of resilient systems. So if the system has these things like diversity and social capital, then it's more likely to have resilience. And so the question is, how can environmental education contribute to these resilience attributes? So let's just take diversity, the first one. And here's just an example, an environmental education program in a community garden in the Bronx. We have diversity in terms of ethnic diversity of the youth that are learning from this older gentleman, all immigrants from the Caribbean. And then you can also imagine diverse practices like you see on the right. So are they growing things that they brought with them when they immigrated or migrated to New York City, the Bronx? And what kinds of practices like seed saving or composting or mulching are they bringing with them? So a diversity of practices, people and plants. So I want to talk about 3 social attributes next. So these are social capital, self-organization, and polycentric governance. So you can think of, let's say you have a deliberative environmental education, one that involves a lot of discussion, maybe like Earth Force. I'm not sure if you have it in Australia, but where students are, they're students and community members, they're discussing projects, and then they maybe go on and do some action project. So as they're having all these discussions and doing all this planning, there's a possibility, or we hope, that they'll form positive connections, social connections, maybe develop common norms. And this is what we would call, at least one, Eleanor Ostrom's definition of social capital. There's self-organization. They're going to convert, say, a vacant lot into a green space. They're not waiting for the city government to do this. They're self-organizing to do it themselves. And then there's polycentric governance. And that has to do with networks of organizations that actually determine policy, not just government. So here's a slide that from some work by the US Forest Service and others that did a social network analysis of environmental stewardship organizations. And again, this is in New York City. And you can see by the colors that these organizations include civic groups, like maybe a community gardening group, or maybe a group that is focused on hunger and food donations from the garden. So there's all kinds of groups that are coming together. And schools, so groups that have, as well as the civic groups, often have a focus on education. So there's, again, a lot of environmental learning opportunities. But I think the point is that the schools or the environmental organizations that we work with can be part of these networks. So we're no longer talking about learning per se, but we're talking about organizational networks and how by working together that we have a sort of polycentric, many-centered system of governance, which can determine things about how land is managed or governed in a system like New York City. Okay, and then the last one I have is ecosystem services and social learning. This, if you could see to the right, we have a parking lot to the right of what's shown in this slide. This is in the Bronx again, so there's a lot of runoff, a lot of paved surfaces, a lot of industrial pollutants. And on the left is the Bronx River. So we have this youth program, it's called Rocking the Boat, where the kids are building a bioswale garden. And they're providing ecosystem services such as reducing water runoff or filtering the water that's running off into the river. And you can imagine that they're learning from each other, as well as scientists, educators, other people, community members that are involved in this activity. And then this is just a slide of their final garden that they made. So to conclude, I wanted to summarize by talking about EE and social ecological resilience. First, I think that EE can foster these attributes of resilient social ecological systems like social capital and ecosystem services. And this is the polycentric governance one. EE organizations per se, whether they be schools or community centers or nature centers, they can be part of these polycentric governance systems, local networks of nonprofits, government agencies, sometimes businesses, schools. And then third, EE can foster social, ecological, and psychological resilience. And this provides what I call as a way out of our kind of long-standing debate in EE about instrumental goals versus emancipatory goals in EE. So the idea that, say, youth are working on this bioswale garden to provide this ecosystem services, so they're, building green infrastructure for the city is very instrumental, I think, that they're doing something behavior-wise. And a lot of people in EE feel like we should be empowering them and letting them decide their own activities. But I think a lot of these things that we're talking about can work on both sort of psychological resilience through working in nature, through providing something to the community, as well as social ecological resilience at the same time. And then finally, resilience fosters cross-disciplinary thinking and solutions. So for those of you who are familiar with the ideas of transformational learning and Meseroff, he talks about how, if you're experience a discrepant event, like a lot of this is in the wilderness outdoor adventure literature, you're out away from your normal activities and everything is really different and strange. And so it's very discrepant, and that's often where transformational thinking, transformational learning occurs. And it's a parallel to this idea of environmental or social disturbances spur transformations in how we manage our land. I just wanted to mention that we do have quite a few writings on this. And 10 years ago, Cecilia Lundholm from Stockholm University and Ryan Plummer from Ontario, I worked with them and we did a special issue of environmental education research on resilience learning and environmental education. It was also published as a book. So, it'd be great if any of you kind of look back at there and see how things have changed in the last 10 years. And, I'd love to hear from you and get your perspectives on this and any updates. But we do try to keep up our publications on our website. We have a publications link. So thank you, stay safe. And I do as I said, like the ideas of social ecological resilience, but I'm kind of on that transformation side more than the adaptation side. So I don't know if we have time for questions.
Some time, but firstly, on behalf of our hang on, am I on?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Now you can hear me. There you go. It's everybody's dream to have me be quiet, so that's great. Marianne, thank you very much, and on behalf of our audience across Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world that are tuning in, thank you very much, and we appreciate your time this morning, coming from the beautiful part of the world, Ithaca in New York State, so a lovely part of the world. We do have a couple of questions. The first question that is more for me to answer is that the question was, are the sessions being recorded? And I'm told that they are. I'm not sure what the release process will be. We'll find that out for you, but they are being recorded, and you should be able to get access to them soon at some stage. We do have a couple of other questions. We had a couple of people tune out, Marianne, and just wanted to know, could you just very quickly give us the definition of panarchy again?
Panarchy? Yeah, so panarchy is basically, it captures these adaptive cycles that operate at different scales and of time and space, and that influence each other. Both the smaller scales can, build up and influence the larger scales, and the larger scales, like a whole city or a whole region, could also influence the lower scales, like a small little patch of land. Does that help?
That's fantastic. We've also had another question from Melissa Doherty, who's asked what your thoughts are on state and transitions models used in ecology, but with applicability to social interventions.
State transition models in ecology, was that the question?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, state and transition models?
I don't think I'm familiar. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough with the state transition models to comment. I don't know if I'm sorry, I forget the name of the person, if they can revise the question a little bit. Help me.
We might ask them to do that. I certainly don't understand it either, so that's not because it's not a good question, it's because I'm not the brightest spark. So David Allen has asked one, though, that I can understand. Regarding panarchy, how do large and fast events, such as climate-related natural disasters, fit into the model?
How does climate-related natural disasters? Thank you for the question. I'm going to have to think about this a little bit. And this is really great because, again, as I said, we worked on this a while ago. And so I appreciate the questions to try to rethink these concepts. So,
fantastic.
But I am going to try to answer a little bit. So I think of climate as being at a very large scale, right? So the disturbance is a large scale, but panarchy is really talking about spatial and time scales. It's not so much in the way it talks about the scale of the disturbance, I think, is whether it's a big enough disturbance to flip, like I said, the tipping point in the adaptive cycle. So it seems like, so is climate, I like to start at the local level first. I think it's a really interesting question because, like, here in Ithaca, you read about all the fires and all the things that are happening, the floods down the Gulf Coast in the US, but we had a fairly normal summer. It was a little bit warm, a little bit dry, but actually really, really pleasant and no disasters. So, we're kind of in that sort of steady state, more or less, just adapting. But I think what will be interesting and to see what are those communities in California, and I'd love to know how things are transpiring in Australia since after you had the devastating fires a little while back. So can we think of what's happening at the community level where these occur, and then how's that scaling up to larger states and the whole country? And actually, I think in terms of policy, from what I read, in Australia, it might be a little bit more like the US. There hasn't been enough push from the bottom to influence a lot the top, but there's, like in the US, all this kind of activity around climate the grassroots activity, the, you know, little communities doing something, is definitely scaling up, like at least to the state level. And I think, you know, I'm hopeful in in a matter of weeks that, you know, we'll have an opportunity to scale up to higher levels too. So I'm not sure. That's about the best I can do off the cuff, but, you know, happy to have a further discussion if you ever want to get in touch with me.
That's great. And Catherine Bourdain's asked the question. It's a great segue to that, I suppose. But you know, what else do you think we can do to help our decision makers better understand this optimistic and empowering perspective on a positive and sustainable approach?
That's a really good question. So again, well, for one thing, again, I don't know what your situation is in Australia, but no, since the fires and all the hurricanes in the US, we don't have that many deniers anymore. You know, the president's kind of like standing up there alone almost. So I think what a lot of people are thinking is that, you know, we can forget the deniers, right? They're not a big enough part of our population anymore that we need to worry about them. I think there's so many, for one thing, well, I think, you know, actually this is kind of cool because social ecological systems thinking, that's sort of combining the disciplines, no matter if you think that it's a little bit of, you know, discipline imperialism or whatever, it is actually provides a good basis for thinking about things like the Green New Deal. So again, the Green New Deal, like, you know, a lot of people just react to it. But what it's really talking about is that we can't move forward on the environmental solutions without bringing the communities along with us. So for example, I heard somebody articulate it really, really well. Like coal miners, they have suffered so much by providing the energy for the US, for our country, for many years, right, with black lung disease and very poor communities. And so are we going to now transition away from coal and leave them behind again? That just doesn't work. So, you know, I think this integration of the social equity issues with the environmental issues is just really important. And who knows, maybe we could look back at the social ecological systems resilience things and it would provide some ways of thinking about it. And there's a bunch of things, efforts now in the US that, like we just had a vision for equitable climate action. You can look it up. And I think the website is Equitable Climate Action. And it's just an example. There were over 160 nonprofits that got together to put this vision together. And again, equitable climate action. So they're bringing in the social and the environmental. And regardless of what people say about the Green New Deal, is, you know, they kind of laugh about it because it's so big. But, you know, maybe we call it something else, but I don't think you're going to be able to move forward on these climate issues without addressing all these equity concerns, at least in the US. I'm not sure, you know, again, Australia is like a different context, but we have so many social equity issues right now that are capturing people's attention. And you know, maybe one other thing, as we mentioned earlier, to think about COVID as a disturbance that provides an opportunity for this innovation and transformation to occur.
Professor Marianne Krasny, thank you so much. Just to give you the heads up, in Australia we have a Conservative government and our Prime Minister believes that gas is a great replacement for coal. So we've got a way to go, but I believe in hope and I believe in the great science and the great thinkers that will change the politics we trust. Again, on behalf of everybody here in Australia and New Zealand and other parts of the world that are tuning in, thank you so much for your time today. If your question hasn't been answered, we didn't get a chance to ask, Marianne, we will find a way to get those questions answered for you and get them across to you. But thanks to those people who ask questions, we encourage you to continue to do that through the day. So we'll let Professor Krasny go off and enjoy the rest of the morning or the evening in her part of the world. We're now going to take a 10-minute video break, everybody. So you've got exactly 10 minutes by your clock, wherever you are in the world, to sit and enjoy a video presentation, race to the bathroom or grab yourself a tea or a coffee or some water, and we'll be back in exactly 10 minutes. Thank you.
Climate Clever is an innovative, data-driven, app-based program that helps schools and their communities to reduce their carbon footprint and save money on their utility bills. The app is based around 3 modules: measure, audit and action. The measure module calculates consumption, costs and carbon emissions from electricity, gas, water and waste. The audit module allows the students to run around the whole school and count how many energy and water consuming appliances there are, so they can really understand the resource consumption in the school. And then the action plan provides evidence-based recommendations, which is really using peer learning to understand what they should implement from no cost all the way through to the most expensive initiatives.
So the major benefit of being involved financially for the school is we were able to get our fixtures, toilets, etc. reclassified, so we were being overcharged $8,000 a year. And also children being involved in tree planting exercise that's been going for 2 years, where we planted over 100,000 trees. And that's offset the carbon emissions of all the schools involved. The kids take ownership of the program, they monitor power, water, waste, and then they take all of those things they've learned home and they're planting gardens, composting, getting chickens in the backyard. So there's all of that flow-on effect from being involved in the program that benefits not only the school but the wider community.
My favourite part of the Climate Clever program is the cooking program and the gardening program at our school.
Every day when I come to school, I feel good that I'm doing something important for the planet.
If we didn't have the Climate Clever program coming to school, every day would pretty much be miserable. I reckon that we are helping change the future of the world.
The CRC for Low Carbon Living initially funded us to do a scoping study so we could understand what programs existed around Australia that were helping schools to reduce their carbon footprint, as well as identify barriers facing schools wanting to decarbonise. And all of that went into the development and the design of our Low Carbon Schools pilot program, which has gone on to inform the design of the app.
So the Climate Clever program between 2015 and 2017 saved a total of 266 tonnes of carbon emissions, and on a per student basis that's actually a 20% reduction. We also saw that the schools saved a total of $16 per student, that's an average across their utility bills from electricity, gas and water.
We launched Climate Clever nationally this year and we're really excited to have already 30 schools on board from across 5 states, and we've got a bunch of industry partners, several local councils as well as Horizon Power in Western Australia.
So the city as a partner has really benefited from having direct access to the online platform and the app that the schools use to input their data. And this is incredible data that we've never had access to before. There hasn't been any other program like it that's so multi-beneficial in terms of education and climate action.
We live in a place of amazing natural beauty and biodiversity. Surrounded by such abundance, we can often take it for granted. I'm an artist and I've spent my life painting nature. I also work with scientists. Combining both of these, I present environmental science art workshops. These take children out into nature to study whole environmental systems where they look at all of the associated plant and animal communities. At the park or beach, the focus is usually playing wild games, riding, kicking balls. These are really great, but children are unaccustomed to noticing the details of the environment all around them. What I love about working with children is their joy of discovery. I encourage them to look beyond the obvious. Our Biodiversity Survey, which seems more like a treasure hunt, is actually very methodical. These field trips are often the first time that children have engaged with nature in this way. And the rules are simple. Observe and record carefully. Back at the school, in the classroom, we draw from field guides and other resources. The tiniest soil mite and aquatic invertebrates to the fungi, plants, insects, reptiles, birds, marsupials, mammals, everything that lives in that system. Using digital technology, we can gaze on nature's tiny secrets under magnification. You've got no idea how exciting this is. The small invertebrates that live in the water are like wonderful aliens to the children's imagination, and their drawings express this instant connection. Students can see and make short videos in real time of the tiny details in nature. Working with small groups, it's possible to demonstrate colour mixing and painting techniques in an unhurried way. With the work of many hands, our artwork grows over days, showing layers of living things all interacting as they would in nature. It is possible to paint complex natural systems because the painting can be like a huge stylized diagram. We can graphically show zonation, adaptions, and feeding relationships. Children are visual learners. Having drawn and painted a thing, it becomes part of their imagination. The details stay with them, and so too do the conversations we've had whilst working together. We talk about what we can do individually and collectively to conserve and protect our shared natural places and how we can live lightly on the planet. Collaborating on a large painting is a process children don't forget. The painting becomes part of their memory of primary school. It is itself a biology lesson without words. Each child who contributes is completely invested in it and in the environment that we studied together. This is a very fun way to grow in awareness and understanding of nature. It is also the path to sustainable life choices, because the children will want to protect those environments they made their own by studying and painting them together.
In this digital age, the need to play and explore outdoors is even more crucial than ever. Hi, I'm Richard Olive and I manage the education programs for the Parks and Wildlife Service. Here at the Perth Hills Discovery Centre, we offer a variety of activities to provide hands-on learning experiences in the natural environment. For example, the Nearer to Nature and Cadets programs are specially designed to engage and educate school-aged children as well as the broader community about our unique plants and animals and the wonderful landscapes that surround us. The Nearer to Nature Schools program offers curriculum-linked excursions at our purpose-built education centres and other venues across the Perth metro area and the southwest. If time is limited, we can even bring the natural environment into the classroom with incursions and resource packs.
Over at that bush over there, see the silver bush? There you go, perfect, that was cool.
We also have Nearer to Nature Community, which offers a range of activities such as fun-filled school holiday programs at beach, bush, forest, river and swamp locations. Our team of educators also work closely with teachers across WA in the delivery of the highly successful Bush Ranger and River Ranger cadet programs. We're happy to answer any questions you have, so if you're eager to get nearer to nature, give us a call today or book online.
Our next presenter, ladies and gentlemen, comes from one of the most beautiful assets that Victoria has, and it's the Royal Botanical Gardens. Charlotte Fletcher is the Southern Bandicoot Outreach Officer at the Royal Botanic Gardens, which Charlotte, I believe, reopened just this weekend or is about to reopen. But anyway, it's great that we'll be able to go and put our hands on the beautiful grass there at the gardens again and see the beautiful plants that you have. Charlotte is responsible for designing and implementing community engagement initiatives centred around creating a Bandicoot-friendly community. This builds connection to nature in residents southeast Melbourne and raises awareness about the existence of endangered bandicoots in residential areas and appropriate conservation actions. Charlotte has a Bachelor of Science Honours in Ecology from the University of Sydney and a Masters of Science Communication Outreach from the Australian National University. She's previously developed and delivered education and family programs for the University of Sydney, ANU, Australian National Maritime Museum, Melbourne Museum and Questacon. Her work at the Royal Botanic Gardens sits at the exciting intersection of programming, citizen science and behaviour change for conservation. And we're going to enjoy a great conversation with her today as we all get on board the bandy wagon from Victoria's Royal Botanical Gardens. Ladies and gentlemen, Charlotte Fletcher.
Thanks so much, Grant. Lovely to be here. And you're correct, the Royal Botanic Gardens has just reopened. We've been closed for a month or two as Melbourne suddenly got very interesting over the last few months. So the central Melbourne Gardens is in town is reopened as of Saturday, and Cranbourne Gardens, which is the site that I'm based at, where we have our bandicoots, is reopened as of Monday this week. So if you happen to be within 5Ks of either of those, you can go and get your nature fix there. And I'm quite jealous because I don't live within 5Ks of either, so harder for me to pop down to the office. I am presenting some work today, not only the work that we are doing at Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria in the Bandicoot outreach space, but there's this wonderful Bandicoot outreach work and environmental education work actually happening all over the country. There are Bandicoot citizen science projects happening in lots of major centres, and so today I'll be talking about the work that we're doing in Melbourne and also a bit of the work that's happened in Mandurah. Seeing as we can't all meet in Mandurah today, I'm going to throw in a bit of information about the Bandicoot programming over in Mandurah. Amanda Krasny, who I put this together with, can't be here today to present, but yes, we'll be chatting about the work that she's been doing with a range of other people who are here. So what we're all aiming to do really is get residents of peri-urban areas on board the bandy wagon, comfortable with bandicoots, create bandicoot friendly communities, and figure out how people and bandicoots are interacting in cities and the urban outskirts. So we'll share some insights from 2 citizen science urban conservation programs. Before we go any further, I do need to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work. So where I am, that's the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and over in around Amanda's project, the Noongar people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we've got a couple of themes today. Firstly, we'll explore how people and bandicoots interact in suburban and peri-urban environments and some research that speaks to that. And then the kinds of programs that we're running and the kinds of interventions that we're developing to try to make the relationship between people and bandicoots safe and productive for everybody. Firstly, just in case you're not from a bandicoot area, I know chatting to the AV folks earlier, they're on the Central Coast, so they've got bandicoots. If you're around Mandurah, you might have bandicoots. If you're in southeast Melbourne, you've probably got some bandicoots somewhere. So they are critters which do turn up on the outskirts of a lot of our major cities. Southern brown bandicoots, Isodono bestulus, and Quenda, Isodon fusciventa, are pretty related species. When I refer to Quenda, that's a reference to the Western Australian subspecies of the bandicoots, and southern brown bandicoots, that's what we've got in Victoria, South Australia, New South Wales and Tasmania. So they're about the size of a rabbit. They live in heath and heathy woodland vegetation, and they dig for their preferred foods of fungi and invertebrates. So they love truffles and beetles, and one of our favourite things when working with school kids is to point out that our bandicoots actually have sparkly poo because of all the beetles they eat. Here we go. The light is not good enough there, but they actually have sparkly poo from the beetles that they're eating. So there's lots of little wonderful things like that that actually do make them very endearing to kids and families. So in the course of digging for beetles and grubs and invertebrates and truffles and all sorts of wonderful things, they do provide important ecosystem services. So our bandicoots we refer to as ecosystem engineers, along with potoroos and bettongs and echidnas. A single southern brown bandicoot can turn over about 4 tonnes of soil over the course of a year in the course of digging for their food. So that helps to allow water to penetrate into the soil, incorporate organic matter into the soil by covering up leaf litter. In the course of covering up the leaf litter, that reduces fuel load for bushfires. It incorporates the organic matter to enrich the soil. Some of our soils, of course, being very nutrient poor or hydrophobic. And so there is wonderful research out of Western Australia showing just how useful this bandicoot digging is for strength of trees when they're growing, all sorts of things. So they're really great to have around. They're just, wonderful little critters to have from an ecological perspective. So why do we want to try and conserve them in the suburbs specifically? You know, they're in national parks all over the country. Why are we so concerned about trying to make sure that bandicoots can survive in peri-urban and suburban areas? So bandicoots are sometimes referred to as urban adapters. They are able to use a few of the human-provided resources. They will eat pet food. They will live in clumps of black. So they will adapt to modified landscapes. So they do have a chance of persisting in suburban and peri-urban areas if the threats aren't too significant. So given that they have that ability to persist, it does create a wonderful opportunity to promote nature connection through these charismatic species. So if we can suggest that our charismatic little bandicoots are worthy of conservation effort, then that of course does have that umbrella effect and enable people to feel a little bit closer to nature. Urban conservation is of course an important field in its own right, particularly when our national parks and reserves are under threat. So many threatened species are found only in urban areas or within urban boundaries, so they are a vital part of urban conservation. And of course those ecosystem engineering features as well are fantastic. And when you consider that our southern brown bandicoots lost up to potentially 30% of their known range in the 2019 to 2020 summer bushfires, the estimation was I think between 10 and 30% of their known range was burnt. So when you consider that that's what's happening in our national parks, it becomes more and more important to conserve them wherever we have the option. So how do people and bandicoots interact in our peri-urban and suburban areas? So firstly, in Mandurah, so just south of Perth, quenda are rarely sighted in the innermost suburbs of Perth. There's not a lot of remnant vegetation up there. It's quite isolated when it is. So the main places they're hanging on is in the Perth Hills and places like Mandurah, just a little bit further from the urban centres. So they're doing fairly well in Mandurah. It's one of the last kind of strongholds, and I'm going to keep using that word. But it is under rapid urban development. So the quenda there are potentially under a bit of pressure from that rapid urban development. There's a map here of recorded quenda diggings. So you can see that they are active in quite a few spots around city of Mandurah. And so because there's the stronghold of bandicoots of quenda around Mandurah, there was an ARC linkage project between City of Mandurah and Murdoch University over the last few years that's wrapped up now, but trying to work in this urban conservation and community engagement space. And so to Melbourne, which I can speak on a little bit more eloquently. So southern brown bandicoots in the 1800s were totally widespread throughout Melbourne. They were everywhere. They were apparently quite a good snack. They're now only found on the city's southeastern edge. So they're, for anyone who is familiar with Melbourne, up until the 70s, you'd find them up into the sort of sandbelt suburbs around Oakleigh, Glen Waverley. But now they're only found down on the very edge of Melbourne's urban boundary. So you can track the urban expansion and the bandicoot movement pretty closely. And so because we do have this remaining population of southern brown bandicoots in the little oasis that is the Cranbourne Botanic Gardens, we do have a state-funded Bandicoot Brigade outreach project, which we started last year, to try to make sure that we don't lose them from those last few southeastern suburbs, because we do have this wonderful site that is Cranbourne Gardens. We have 360 hectares or so of bushland. Some of it has a history of sand mining, some of it's a little bit older, but either way we've got this large site of with all this great heathy vegetation, which has enabled bandicoots to hang on in what is an increasingly suburban area. So before we can figure out how to work on the people bandicoot relationship, we need to figure out where the bandicoots are. So in this Backyard Bandicoots project in Mandurah, they've conducted some research on how quenda are using residential properties. So quenda were more likely to be found in gardens which were close to bushland, had less paving, had provided food, so some people do put food out for bandicoots, and had lower dog activity. So these papers are in preparation. And they were seen consuming provided food, digging in lawn and gardens, and interacting with humans. Even things like bit me on the finger or sat on my foot were interactions that people had reported with bandicoots. So they do get a bit cocky, and we've observed around Cranbourne Gardens as well. There's the occasional bandicoot which decides that the cafe is the best place to hang out, and at 4:30 will come and clean up all the crumbs. So they're opportunistic. So we know that bandicoots will use a lot of backyards. They will even use backyards with cats in them. That was one of the more surprising findings from the Mandurah work. But how do people feel about the bandicoots using these spaces? So the Cranbourne community are quite likely to support bandicoot conservation actions in the area. So this is a study by Sarah Blair, who's now at the Victorian National Parks Association, a few years ago. So she surveyed community attitudes towards bandicoot conservation actions in the suburbs surrounding the Cranbourne Botanic Gardens. So they were overall pretty likely to support bandicoot conservation actions, but they did have some serious concerns over snake activity. For bandicoots, we do recommend that people plant long, dense grasses, and of course that can similarly be a bit of a snake habitat. Mandurah residents, it was found that they often mistook quenda for rats, but once they knew that what they had was quenda, not rats, they were generally willing to share their gardens. So we've got a chance. People, on the whole, are interested in bandicoots, and of course every survey asking people for their attitudes towards backyard bandicoots, you will get a bit of a skew towards people who already are interested, but each survey does manage to get a few negative responses too, which is helpful for balance. But yes, so once we deal with the rat thing, then we can work on what people can do for quenda. But for a start, we need to convince them that what they've got is actually a bandicoot or a quenda. So how do we build these safe, productive relationships? There are a few different ways that a bandicoot-friendly suburb can be made bandicoot-friendly. So as part of the moving of Melbourne's urban growth boundary a few years ago, this is what prompted our bandicoot outreach project. So the Botanic Gardens was going to be surrounded by more and more houses, and areas which traditionally could have been used for bandicoot movement were now going to be relatively dense residential. So there's a plan for what we do about the bandicoots, where we want to put houses. How do we fix it? So there are a few actions which are outlined in that sub-regional species strategy, and a few actions which people can do in their own backyards. So if we have people who can recognise bandicoots, then we're not going to have accidental misrepresentation that there's rats there. If we can encourage cat and dog containment, that helps. If we can encourage habitat gardening and plant bandicoot suitable plants, that's great. Permeable fences allow better movement. Appropriate use of baits and pesticides, of course, links right back up to improved identification skills. We don't want rat poison being put out there. And then things like habitat retention, road infrastructure like culverts and fencing, and fox control, those come more under landscape scale management, council activities, state government activities. So residents can control some of these things. They can't necessarily decide to purchase a 40-hectare new reserve or put a culvert under a road, but they can put a hole in their fence or plant a couple of lamandras or keep their cat inside at night. So there are lots of really simple things that residents can control to make their suburb more bandicoot friendly. But how do we communicate with them? So in order to make sure that our conservation messaging has the best best possible chance of succeeding. Many of you would be familiar with the Schwarz human values framework, but basically people hold each of these values at different strengths and favour different values as guiding principles. So some messages will appeal more than others depending on which values they align with. So in the top right self-transcendence corner, we have universalist and benevolent values like equality, unity with nature, broad-mindedness, harmony, all that jazz. And on the opposite side, we have achievement and power-related values like intelligence, capability, preserving public image, authority, success. So if we target messaging towards values in one section of the circumplex, that can actually activate and promote related, closely placed values and strengthen our messaging, and can dampen the influence of values on the opposite side of the circumplex. So that gives us a little bit of a guideline as to how we might want to tackle some of the activities we'd like to promote. So from the different surveys that have been conducted, gleaning resident attitudes to bandicoots, we have a few samples here. So resident comments can be roughly grouped into the people who are already engaged, the people that we can target with clear actions and leadership opportunities to create community advocates. So these people are probably driven by universalist values, maybe pride as well, but there will tend to be those kinds of universalist unity with nature kinds of values. One such respondent in Sarah Blair's 2016 study mentioned that last year some of our neighbours were concerned about rats in their backyards. Turned out they were bandicoots, but some rat poison was put out. There is a real need for education about how to differentiate between rats and bandicoots at the settlers run area. So we have people who are engaged and perhaps slightly judgmental, but they do also have the strong sense of social norms and feeling of authority. So they are working actually into that other side of the value circumplex as well. So we've got a few different values coming through, but ultimately these will help us to figure out what frames are most useful for us to use to communicate particular actions. So we also have people who are interested or mildly positive or might have a little bit of a concern about something, but you know, if they're walking past our Bandicoot information station in the gardens, they'll probably stop and say hi and play a game of Rat or Bandicoot with us. So we can work with them on understanding simple actions or the consequences of everyday decisions. So we might not be able to turn them into advocates in the community policing their neighbours, but we can work with them on the unintended consequences of using rat poison or that kind of thing. And then, of course, there are people who are uninterested or disengaged, such as the person who mentioned in the interview that they've blocked them off, they don't like them digging in the garden. So really, they're not a huge target for us. They're not a huge proportion of the residents, certainly around Cranbourne. So we work with different audiences in different ways. And you can see the values displayed by different comments. So things like digging holes, big holes, that does tend to think that tend to make you think about how people might be thinking about protecting property. Comments like, I like that it's healthy for the area to have a range of animals still in the area. So that's definitely playing into those benevolent and universalist sort of connection with nature style values. We have straight up comments about communing with nature through connecting with bandicoots, which is lovely. That's what we want to hear. And of course, totally relevant concern. I do not want to encourage snakes and feel that bandicoots may be a food source for local snakes. So that's something that's playing into quite a different part of the value circumplex, that feeling of security and safety, which is extremely valid. But of course, the challenge for people living in areas where they think the bandicoots might be encouraging the snakes is you've probably got snakes already. So to bring together audiences' values and behaviours, we do need to target everyone with improved identification skills. And so we can work into spaces like achievement and power if we need to. So we play a lot of relatively competitive bandicoot or rat identification games with schools. So if we need to work to that other side of the circumplex rather than appealing to their love of nature, that's totally doable. Responsible pet ownership is a challenging one, but again, there's a few different values that we could approach to tackle that. Habitat gardening, again, there's a couple of different angles that we could use for that. So we can appeal to that connection to nature or to the sense of security. And I'll talk about fence modifications more in a moment. So here you will be seeing a game of Bandicoot or rat. So with each picture, do have a guess as to whether you think it is a Bandicoot or a rat. And a nice comment from one of the surveys. I thought it was a rat, then they put a big sign up the road saying Bandicoot crossing, so we Googled it. So it really is a fundamental component to success with any other initiatives. We sort of have to deal with this before we can deal with anything else. So there's a range of games that we've been using both in Victoria and in Mandurah to work to this, and also things like backyard monitoring, making sure that contact details are easily accessible for consultation. If people don't know what they've seen, they can give me a buzz and I'll try and sort it out for them. And try to steer clear where possible of the deficit model thinking, and try to sort of acknowledge that not everyone should automatically know what a bandicoot is. So responsible pet ownership is, of course, a big communication challenge. Actually, mostly I leave this one to Zoos Victoria around Melbourne, and a big enforcement challenge. So the community around both Cranbourne and Mandurah were generally supportive of cat confinement. But suffice to say, leading with the safety of the cat and appealing to security and power values can be a way of approaching some audiences who might not be swayed by simply saying cats kill wildlife, keep them inside. We want to promote habitat gardening. Again, we have to work, one of the models in Victoria which has worked really well, which is promoted by Gardens for Wildlife Victoria, is a very personalised model to promote habitat gardening, where local councils actually provide volunteers or work with volunteers who will go out and have a look at people's gardens, figure out what they want to promote, and try to assist them in coming up with habitat gardening interventions which will work to the kind of goals that they have. So we're not assuming that everybody wants to turn their backyard into a bandicoot haven, but if we can at least get them to plant a few things for bees or nectar feeding birds, then that sort of starts that nature connection journey. And so if anyone is really keen, we will assist with fence modifications for bandicoot access. There are various ways people can acquire free plants and seeds to try to improve the biodiversity in their garden. So this is a really wonderful kind of program which we're working more and more into. And when I mention fence modifications, I mostly put this in because I love this video. This is our bandicoot gate that we have in the fence of the Botanic Gardens, and it's got a flap that the pointy nose of the bandicoot can open, but rats and rabbits can't. So it's quite a good way of reassuring residents that we can try and improve access for bandicoots to their property, but it doesn't necessarily improve access for everything else as well. So we have lots of programs to try to work to all of these communication points. It's a sort of a broad and terrifying remit sometimes, but very exciting. So we had our event last year, and we'll do it again, our big bandicoot backyard with our giant bandicoot sculpture made from weeds from the bushland at Cranbourne Gardens. It's wonderful. Her name is Nibbles. And we're just starting a new initiative, Bandicoot Brigade. So working with a database of local residents to provide things like free seeds, access to local spotlighting events, fence modifications, that kind of thing. So this should have started 6 months ago, but COVID happened. So I'll be able to tell you more about that next year. Of course, working in with local Gardens for Wildlife programs, because they're already doing wonderful stuff in the habitat gardening space, and local school partnerships. So we've got a few different levels of school engagement depending on basically the proximity of the school to bandicoots. So families that might be in the local government area that has bandicoots, it's good if they know that they're there. So I'll work with those schools to just, you know, deliver a lesson and tell them what a bandicoot is, and we might do some drawing or some artwork. As the schools get closer and closer to bandicoot areas, and as we're dealing with schools where kids might have bandicoots in the backyards, then we'll do some more higher level engagement. So we might work on a longer term project together. And then those where the school itself is in a bandicoot area, we're working on planning a few habitat gardens. So again, watch this space. It's quite exciting. So in summary, bandicoot-friendly suburbs can exist and we can improve them. It does make it easier if people know what a bandicoot is, and once people can identify a bandicoot, you can start working on conservation actions. It is worthwhile considering the values and targeting the same messages for different audiences to ensure that you're communicating efficiently. And of course, each community is unique, and awareness of local issues helps avoid conflict. So we work really closely with local government and local community members. There are a hell of a lot of people involved in these projects. So Catherine Bourdains and Bonnie Bill Richardson, we're working with Amanda Krasny on the Western Australian project. I have collaborators at Cardinia Shire Council, City of Casey, Port Phillip Western Port CMA, Deakin University, Victorian National Parks Association, and of course our project is supported by the Victorian State Government. And if anybody wants to get involved in bandicoot conservation, currently the Quend account is happening, run by WWF. Do check out our rbg.vic.gov.au/Southern Brown Bandicoot if you're in Victoria. And of course, what we want people to do all over the place is report sightings on iNaturalist to improve our database. Thank you very much. And hopefully I'm able to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. We're just trying to organise the questions for you now. That was a fantastic presentation. And you might have said it, but just very quickly, if you could tell us, if you wanted to see a bandicoot, what would be the best way to do it?
Depends where you are. Head to the outskirts of your major city, wherever there's some heathy remnant vegetation, and have a look for little snout pokes in the ground. So your best indicator of local bandicoots is your bandicoot diggings. This is a cast I made of a bandicoot digging. So they've got these distinctive conical holes that they make in the ground. Whereas by comparison, a rabbit, when it's not digging a burrow, makes a trench-shaped hole. So go to your local heathy woodland vegetation on the edge of your major city and have a look for conical holes.
Fantastic. We have some questions that we'll get you to try and answer, Charlotte, if you could. So one of the questions I've got from Catherine Bourdains is, how can we increase linkages in habitat to facilitate bandicoot movement?
Oh, I wish I had a simple answer. So I guess the general idea behind the habitat gardening movement is that backyards and front yards can actually form part of a habitat corridor. So certainly what we're seeing around Cranbourne, where I'm working, is a few isolated bandicoot populations and not a lot of connectivity between them. So we're keeping an eye basically on local infrastructure projects to try to find opportunities where there's a road upgrade or a new development, and ensure that those opportunities are taken to upgrade infrastructure, include culverts, include fencing, include fauna crossings, include appropriate revegetation. And so local councils have actually been really easy to work with on that front. So that's certainly one component, is habitat gardening, and then keeping an eye on those infrastructure projects for those opportunities because the opportunities to buy new reserves are a little fewer and far between.
Thanks, Charlotte. I've got one here from Cam McKenzie who's asking, have you considered using Callett's nature-related values typology?
I will note that down and have a look later. So no, not yet, but certainly we'll check it out. Thank you.
No worries. Well, I have to apologise because I didn't understand the question. Not that it's not a good question, Cam, but I'm trying to. The questions are making me sound a lot smarter than I am. So we'll get some answers for you though. Where a presenter can't do the questions for you, we will. Catherine's asked, in urban areas, is there a confusion between rats and bandicoots? I think you've answered that, but that has been a major issue, obviously.
Yeah. So it does, I think, though, lead to really great conversations. So the email exchanges and the phone calls that I have with people, once they see an indication somewhere, a poster or a flyer that there may be bandicoots in your area, and they suddenly go, hang on, is that not a rat? That's really exciting. And so making sure that people have access to just things like wildlife cameras can be really, really helpful to try and actually sort that question out for people. Half the time it is a rat, or a lot of the time actually it is a rat. So we probably get more questions that turn out to be rats, but it's still an opportunity to have that discussion and to prompt people to look out for other signs like the diggings and like the scat.
Charlotte, there's a lot of questions here. We're not going to get a chance to answer, but we'll find a way to get them to you and get answers to all those who have asked. It's been fantastic. And as always, great topics mean that we run out of time. So we're going to take a video break now. But on behalf of everybody at the A2E National Conference today, I'd like to thank you for your time and wish you well with the stuff that you're doing at the Royal Victorian Botanical Gardens. We're going to take a 5-minute break, video break now, folks. We'll be back with our next presenter very soon.
Bush Ranger Cadets is awesome. It gives students opportunity to do stuff which is different from the classroom.
They get to see a lot of Australia where they wouldn't normally.
We take them out in a controlled environment, or we control it as much as we can, and we allow them to experience life.
We're very proud to create a community where our cadets, they get to know each other, they work together, they support each other, but they also teach each other. They teach each other the skills that they've learnt, and they pass them on to the younger generation that comes after them.
It's just mind-blowing, the community work that we do out here.
We often ask our students to be leaders, but we don't actually give them the opportunity to lead. And the thing about cadets, they actually have to become leaders and actually lead the other younger students.
It's at the classroom, outside the classroom. We learn a lot of stuff. We do have a lot of fun, there's a lot of games, there's a lot of patting dolphins at Monkey Mire and going up to Ningaloo Reef and going down to the beach down south. Ball driving, orienteering, there's a lot of fun aspect to it too, but we do get out there, we do get our hands dirty. You are going to work, you're going to be tired, exhausted, to the point that you nearly collapse, but you're going to enjoy every single minute of it.
It teaches students a lot of leadership qualities, also to think for themselves and to try and come up to a solution of if they're stuck somewhere, do this. It's just conservation as well, appreciating the land and not abusing it.
The cadets is a wonderful opportunity to go camping. It's unfortunately a lot of students don't get that opportunity at home nowadays. And with camping comes a whole heap of being self-directed and self-motivated, looking after yourself.
The students actually participate, they become involved, and they get the sense of accomplishment. They can achieve, they can do things. Work together as a team for the benefit of all.
I'm also blessed by a group of absolutely wonderful instructors who give of their time and of their skills and of their passions to help our cadets.
It's just fabulous to think that this is tied into our school. So yeah, when's the next one, Andrew?
I'm remember the first time I saw a blue whale.
Oh, look, look. Wow.
I followed them since childhood.
What do you think it's from? Is it from a ship?
I could see plastic everywhere. We were in what we thought was a relatively pristine environment. I started to wonder what was happening in oceans elsewhere on the planet. Growing up, my world was the ocean. It's where I feel the most spiritual.
As a freediver, it was the place where I proved myself to myself. Finally, have the opportunity to pay the sea back.
Only a fraction of the plastic that we produce is recycled.
This is never going to degrade. It's got nowhere to go.
This was something that these animals, they were forced to endure because it was man-made and we'd put it into their environment.
The record is 276 pieces of plastic inside of one 90-day-old chick.
If the plastics are in the food chain for the dolphin, they're also in our food chain.
Exactly.
Communities are built on these landfill sites.
So sweet potatoes, corn, sugarcane, all growing on 40 years of garbage.
Do you have anything not wrapped in plastic?
No.
No.
We have to make our life better for our kids' children.
Change is possible. It starts with us.
Well, it's powerful stuff, and I know that everybody is aware of it, but it's just something we've just got to work harder at ourselves and in our own communities. My family and I do a rubbish run every few weeks where we go down to the Mooney Ponds Creek with a plastic bag and pick up any rubbish that's there, and it's amazing in one patch what will return after we've removed it. So, powerful video. My apologies, everybody. I was meant to give you a 5-minute break before, but it was such a fantastic program of content that I missed it and kept you all at your chairs. So that was a nice little break there. The videos are such powerful videos, though, that I don't think people are leaving their screens. So I'm sure you'll rest up later on. Our next presenter, ladies and gentlemen, Bryony Towers, is a research fellow at the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University. Her research interests include child-centred disaster risk education, risk reduction, disaster risk education, school emergency management, and climate change adaptation in the education sector. Her multidisciplinary approach to research is grounded in social cultural theories of human development and informed by theories and practice of child participation, critical pedagogy, place-based education, and community-based disaster risk education. She completed a PhD in socio-cultural psychology at the University of Tasmania, which involved a qualitative investigation of how children living in fire-prone areas of southeastern Australia understand and manage bushfire risk. She's also conducted research for emergency management agencies around Australia, including New South Wales Rural Fire Service, New South Wales Fire and Rescue, the WA Department of Fire and Emergency Services, and the Victorian Country Fire Authority. She's also conducted research for Plan International and Save the Children in Indonesia and the Philippines. She's a member of the Commonwealth Attorney General's Disaster Resilience Education Strategy Group, the 000 Australia Working Group, and the Victorian Country Fire Authority's Schools in Fire Country Working Group. Please welcome Bryony Towers.
Okay, so thank you. And my presentation is called Disaster Risk Reduction Education, Pathways Towards a Critical Pedagogy of Place. I'd like to acknowledge the Dja Djurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which I am presenting to you from today. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I want to start today by sharing a really important conceptual framework that underpins current thinking in disaster risk reduction. So at the core of this framework is the well-established notion that disasters are not natural, and that the term natural disaster is actually a misnomer because it attributes the cause of disasters to natural events such as floods, earthquakes or bushfires, when in fact over 40 years of disaster research has shown that disasters are caused by social, political, cultural and economic systems, structures and processes that put people and property in harm's way. When deconstructing disaster, we start with the premise that natural processes interact with human systems to create opportunities and resources. So for example, on the side of a volcano, you'll find very fertile soil, and that's why people live there. But natural processes can also interact with human systems to create natural hazards that have the potential to cause loss of life, injury, other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, and environmental degradation. A disaster is what happens when a hazard interacts with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity to cause human, material, economic, and environmental impacts. So what you can see there at the bottom of the slide is the international equation for disaster risk, which is hazard times exposure times vulnerability divided by capacity. So the hazard is the natural event, the flood, the bushfire, the earthquake, the tsunami, the volcanic eruption. We have limited control over that, although we do have some leverage with bushfire by preventing human-caused ignitions and managing fuels in the landscape. But exposure, vulnerability and capacity are socially determined. They are consequences of human decision-making and action. So exposure is the location of people and assets in relation to the hazard. So for bushfire, this is where we have human settlements located in bushfire-prone environments. Vulnerability is the susceptibility of exposed people and assets to damage and loss. So for bushfire, this is where we have people living in the bush in houses that are not designed to withstand the impacts of a bushfire. Then we have capacity, and that is all the knowledge, skills, and resources that we can draw on to reduce risk and increase our ability to respond and recover. And if you're seeing this equation for the first time, it's probably a lot to take in, but don't worry, I'm going to come back to it a little bit later in my presentation. So if disasters are not natural or inevitable, that means there are things that we can do to prevent or mitigate their impacts, which brings us to disaster risk reduction, or DRR. The global framework for DRR is the United Nations Sendai Framework, to which Australia is signatory, and which will guide DRR policy and practice at the international, national and local level for the next 10 years. The Sendai Framework has 4 priorities for action. The first of these is understanding disaster risk, which is all about using existing knowledge of hazards, exposure, vulnerability and capacity to inform the development of DRR activities, from prevention, mitigation and preparedness through to response and recovery. And as noted in section 24 on the slide there, to achieve this at the national and local levels, it will be important to promote the incorporation of disaster risk knowledge, including disaster prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation in formal and non-formal education, as well as in civic education at all levels and in professional education and training. There are also some additional elements of the Sendai Framework that specifically relate to children, youth and DRR education. So in the preamble, it says that governments should engage with relevant stakeholders, including children and youth, in the design and implementation of policies, plans and standards. In the guiding principles, it says that a gender, age, disability and cultural perspective should be integrated in all policies and practices, and women and youth leadership should be promoted. And then in the section on the role of stakeholders, it says that children and youth are agents of change and should be given the space and modalities to contribute to disaster risk reduction in accordance with legislation, national practice and educational curricula. So at this point, I want to offer my definition of DRR education. So there's actually no standard globally accepted definition of DRR education, and those that are floating around actually don't cover it for me. So this here is my take. So the way I see it, the overarching goal of DRR education is to develop a global citizenry that understands the causes and consequences of natural hazards and disasters, and which has the knowledge, skills, attitudes and values to work individually and collectively toward reducing existing disaster risks, preventing the creation of new risks, and strengthening resilience at the local, national and global level. A lofty goal perhaps, but in a world of rapidly escalating disaster risks, it's nothing short of what is needed. And now to the dominant paradigm of DRR education, which probably isn't going to get us to where we need to go. Internationally, the dominant paradigm has really resembled what Paulo Freire referred to as the banking model of education, or what sociocultural psychologist Barbara Rogoff refers to assembly line instruction. So it tends to involve standardized content that decontextualizes children's learning from the social, cultural, economic and environmental context in which they live and in which disaster risk is constructed. There is also the tendency to focus on rote learning of content, so predominantly focused on key safety messages like drop, cover, hold for earthquake and leave early for bushfire, often via worksheets, textbooks or lectures in a classroom setting. In the dominant paradigm, when students are encouraged to take action, that action is usually prescribed by external actors and tends to focus on making household emergency plans and emergency kits using generic templates. And while those activities may well be important, a child rights-based approach actually requires us to give children some voice and choice in the actions that they take and to support their genuine participation in the education process. Finally, the outcomes of DRR education are usually evaluated via quantitative assessments of risk perceptions, recognition and recall of key safety messages, and the completion of prescribed preparedness activities. There is very little opportunity for students to express their views and experiences from their own perspectives or to actively contribute to the evaluation process. While the design and delivery of DRR education in Australia is actually quite progressive by these standards, we're still lacking a guiding framework that can inform DRR education theory, research, policy and practice. And I propose that a critical pedagogy of place can help address that gap. So taking the position that critical pedagogy and place-based education are mutually supportive educational traditions, Gruenwald argues for a conscious synthesis that blends the two discourses into a critical pedagogy of place. Critical pedagogy is socially grounded. It is characterised by a social and educational vision of justice and equality, a belief that education is inherently political, and a dedication to the alleviation of human suffering. Place-based education, meanwhile, is ecologically grounded. It emerges from the particular attributes of place. It is inherently multidisciplinary and experiential, and it connects place with self and community. Both discourses are concerned with the contextual and geographical conditions that shape people and the actions that people take to shape those conditions. So both have major relevance to DRR, but it's blending them together into a critical pedagogy of place that holds the most promise. Because we need critical pedagogy to challenge the assumptions, practices and outcomes that are taken for granted in that dominant paradigm of DRR education and DRR policy and practice more broadly. And we need place-based pedagogy so that DRR education might have some direct bearing on the social and ecological dimensions of hazards and disaster risks in the places that students actually inhabit. So to operationalise these ideas, I'm going to draw on case studies from 3 Victorian primary schools that are challenging that dominant paradigm of DRR education by employing what I think can best be described as critical place-based pedagogies. So the hazard of focus at all 3 schools is bushfire, but I would argue that the approaches that they've been using could be usefully applied to any hazard. So the first school is Anglesey Primary School on the Victorian Surf Coast, where the school has been collaborating with the local CFA Brigade on the Survive and Thrive program since 2015. And in this program, which runs for 2 years over grade 5-6, the children engage in a range of place-based bushfire behaviour and resilience sessions and develop interactive workshops and presentations to educate their community on local bushfire risks. And more recently, the students have also become directly involved in the design and implementation of the Township Emergency Management Plan. The second school is Strethview Primary School, where over the last 4 years, the school has collaborated with the Arthurs Creek Strethview Fire Brigade to develop child-led bushfire risk communication materials for the local community. In this program, the grade 5-6 students create claymation films and books to educate the community about local bushfire risks and to promote a culture of risk reduction and resilience. It's important to note that the Strethview community was devastated by the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. So 27 of the town's 200 residents were killed in the fires, and most of the houses and the school were destroyed. So this program has actually been implemented in that post-disaster context. The third school is Hackaway Primary School, where the grade 5-6 students have been engaging in project-based learning for bushfire safety, and they call their program the Hackaway Bushfire Safety Committee. So the students start by investigating bushfire risk in their own socio-environmental context. Then they identify a local problem or issue of concern. They develop solutions to that problem, and then with guidance and support from subject matter experts, they then share the solutions with their local school community through the development of child-centred risk communication products and activities. So the students have created films, websites, brochures, posters, and interactive workshops, all of which are designed to increase bushfire knowledge and preparedness amongst local children and their families. So I'm now going to draw on these case studies to explore what a critical place-based pedagogy for DRR actually looks like. And for me, it really begins with learning about bushfire as a natural process. It's not uncommon for bushfire education to start with bushfire disasters, but there are actually a few reasons why that's the wrong approach. So firstly, in Australia and elsewhere, fire is an essential part of many natural ecosystems. When students have the opportunity to learn about fire ecology, so fire adapted plant and animal species, and the role of fire in ecosystem regeneration and renewal, they're able to develop an appreciation of the fact that fire is not inherently bad or dangerous, but an essential part of the natural environment. Secondly, knowledge of bushfire behaviour is essential to forming an understanding of how bushfire hazards interact with human systems to create bushfire hazards. So in Strethview and Anglesey, children learn all about what fire ecologist Ross Bradstock refers to as the four switches of fire. So that's biomass, which is fuel availability, dryness, spread, which is driven by weather and topography, and ignition, both human and natural. So the children in Strethview and Anglesey use scientific instruments to measure fuel dryness, temperature, wind speed and humidity, and they use that data to calculate the daily fire danger ratings. They also measure slope to make predictions about how a fire would spread through different parts of the landscape. At Hackaway and Strethview, the students have also used high-tech equipment like this sim table that you can see on the slide there. And this sim table actually simulates how a fire would spread through their local landscape under certain weather conditions. And these kinds of activities provide a really important scaffold for learning about bushfire as a hazard and as a resource. So in Strethview, children have had the opportunity to appreciate fire as a resource by learning about Indigenous fire stewardship. So in 2018, Wurundjeri elder Ian Hunter shared his Indigenous knowledge of fire with the students, who then incorporated that knowledge into their film about Strethview fire history. And it's actually very rare for bushfire education for children to incorporate Indigenous fire knowledge and practices, and a critical pedagogy of place provides a valuable framework for decolonising bushfire education and challenging the assumptions and practices of Western fire management regimes, which arguably are undermining our ability to live with fire. For anyone who is interested in learning more about Indigenous fire stewardship, I highly recommend Dr. Amy Christensen's Good Fire podcast. So now that we've looked at bushfire as a natural process and as a resource, we can explore bushfire as a disaster risk by using that equation of hazard, exposure, vulnerability and capacity. So I'll start with exposure, which we define as a natural process that may cause loss of life, injury or other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption or environmental degradation. So while children might not always have an appreciation of bushfire as a resource, they usually have a very good appreciation of bushfire as a natural hazard. So from a relatively young age, and certainly by middle primary school, children understand the dangers that bushfires can pose. So these quotes are actually from participants in my PhD research, which looked at children's knowledge of vulnerability and resilience to bushfire in southeastern Australia. And as you can see, they have a very firm grasp of the potential for bushfires to cause death, injury, property damage, social and economic disruption, and environmental degradation. So this isn't necessarily something that children need to be taught. It's usually part of their existing knowledge. But it's children's understanding of how the hazard interacts with exposure, vulnerability, and capacity to create hazard impacts and disasters, which requires really careful attention. So we'll start with exposure, which we define as the situation of people, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard-prone areas. Children have a lot of misconceptions about exposure. So while they might recognise that there could be a bushfire in their local area, they often underestimate their own potential exposure because they lack an understanding of how bushfire spreads through the landscape. What we often find is that children living in more built-up areas on the peri-urban interface don't believe their property could be impacted by a bushfire because bushfires are something that happen out there in the bush. When children lack an understanding of how fire can spread via embers and spot fires, they often assume that a road, a river, or a brick wall, or some other non-flammable barrier will protect them and their property or their community from the bushfire hazard. And this is one of the reasons why learning about bushfire as a natural process is so important. So also in Australia, in most Australian states and territories, there are publicly accessible maps which provide reliable information on levels of exposure. For example, in Victoria, we have VicPlan, where you can look up your address and see if you are in the bushfire management overlay, which indicates a very high level of exposure, or if you're in a bushfire prone area, which indicates you could be impacted by embers and spot fires, or if you're in a low risk area, which is unlikely to be impacted at all. So at Hackaway, the children use these maps and cross-reference them with Google satellite maps to get an idea of their potential exposure. So as one of the students said, "Oh my God, I had no idea I was in a bushfire prone area because we are just surrounded by other houses. I'm going to pay so much more attention to bushfire stuff now." So learning about their own level of exposure through place-based learning activities makes bushfire education relevant and meaningful for students. If they don't see themselves or the things they value as being exposed, then there's no problem to solve. And this can really affect the degree to which they purposefully engage with the education process. So next we have vulnerability, which we define as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets or systems to the impacts of hazards. Children are actually very good at identifying the vulnerabilities that exist in their households and communities. So they recognise that as children, they are usually overlooked in public awareness and education programs, and therefore they lack an understanding of how to protect themselves from bushfire hazards. They recognise that disabled people and the elderly may require extra support and assistance to prepare for bushfire emergencies, and that support isn't always provided. They also understand that animals, domestic animals, livestock and wildlife can be highly vulnerable to hazard impacts and need to be considered in emergency management planning, response and recovery. I've also interviewed children living in rental properties who see renting as a major impediment to undertaking any kind of structural mitigation or vegetation management because firstly, it makes no sense to invest your hard-earned dollars into someone else's asset. And secondly, the landlord might not let you do what needs to be done anyway. And Hackaway children have pointed out that leaving the night before a code red fire danger day, as recommended by fire agencies, could be a real challenge for certain members of the community, such as people on low incomes and people who have no one to go and stay with in a low risk area. And that is a really deep insight into disaster vulnerability from those children. And our last component of the disaster risk equation is capacity, which is defined as the combination of all the strengths, attributes, and resources available within an organisation, community, or society to manage and reduce disaster risks and strengthen resilience. There are so many dimensions to capacity, but what I really want to zero on is the capacity of children to reduce disaster risk. Children often assume that DRR is the job of adults, so parents, teachers, firefighters, and governments, and that's correct, but inclusive DRR, as required by the Sendai framework, recognises that everybody has a valuable contribution to make, including children. It's always really great to share stories of children's contributions to DRR with students. So for example, there's the story of Tilly Smith, an 11-year-old schoolgirl from the UK who was on holidays with her family in Phuket on Boxing Day in 2004. And so a few months earlier in her geography class, Tilly had learned about the early warning signs for tsunami. And she was actually able on that day to warn everybody on the beach that a tsunami was coming. And she saved over 100 lives that day. And you should see children's eyes light up when they hear that story. And I think in a critical pedagogy of place, one of our main tasks is to challenge the traditional power structures that marginalise children from contributing to DRR. And stories like Tilly's really show children why challenging those power structures is so important. So when children have the opportunity to build their understanding of bushfire risk as a natural process, as a resource, as a hazard, and as a disaster risk through place-based critical pedagogies, they are able to initiate and lead really valuable and effective DRR initiatives in their communities. The books and films created by the Strethview children are not only being used to increase knowledge and awareness in their own community, they're being used by schools far and wide to help educate children and their families about bushfire risk and what they can do to reduce it. Last year, the children in Strethview also undertook their own student-led evaluation of the program and found that it's having a really positive impact on bushfire safety in their community. And then they presented their evaluation results at the Australian Disaster Resilience Conference. And in doing so, they were able to contribute to the discourse on disaster risk reduction at a national level. And that conference presentation for me was a critical pedagogy of place writ large. In Anglesey, the children have not only been able to increase bushfire knowledge in their families and the wider community, they're also making really valuable contributions to the town's emergency management plan. So Anglesey is a beach town, and so that means in the summer months, the population swells from about 2,500 people to over 15,000. And many of those visitors would have very little knowledge of the local warning systems or where the neighbourhood safer places are, and basically just even what to do if the town comes under threat of bushfire. So the children have been designing materials to help educate tourists about what they will need to do if Anglesey does come under threat. They're also contributing to the community response plan. And they're coming up with really innovative ideas for distributing information around the town during a bushfire emergency. And they're also thinking about how they, as local kids, can support kids from out of town to stay calm and in control during what will actually be a pretty scary experience. In Hackaway, that Vic Plan mapping activity that I talked about earlier, that was actually designed by some grade 5 children who wanted to know what their potential exposure was, but they couldn't find any information online, and there was no readily accessible assessment tool that they could use. So with some guidance from the local CFA office and some bushfire scientists at the CSIRO, they developed that approach with the Vic Plan map and the Google satellite map themselves. Other students at Hackaway have created really great locally relevant educational resources, including a short film about horse safety, which is really good because a lot of the kids in Hackaway have horses but didn't actually have bushfire plans for them. Another group of children designed a poster which provides local residents with information about what to do if they find an injured animal after a bushfire, and how they can care for that animal most effectively. And at the end of the project-based learning unit, once these Hackaway children had decided they were going to actually set up their own bushfire safety committee, they wrote a manifesto on bushfire education for kids, which will now be used by the school to inform their approach to bushfire education going forward. And as you can see, it's quite a detailed document, and we don't have time to read through it now, obviously, but you can download a copy from the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC website, and I've included the link there on the bottom of that slide. So how can we get these critical pedagogies of place into more schools? Well, firstly, around Australia, we're beginning to see a shift in how governments approach community education and engagement for DRR. So traditionally, Australian approaches to community education and engagement have been dominated by top-down information dissemination. So brochures, TV ads, one-way lectures at the local town hall that very few people actually show up to. But DRR legislation, policies, plans and strategies at both the local, state and federal level are beginning to explicitly recognise the importance of bottom-up approaches that facilitate genuine dialogue and citizen participation. And this means we can really start to challenge that dominant paradigm of school-based DRR that I described earlier, because we now have really clear directives from government to adopt more participatory approaches to DRR that privilege the knowledge, perspectives and experiences of those at risk, including children. And the Australian curriculum also provides us with a pathway. So while DRR related content in the Australian curriculum could definitely use an overhaul, I think, we actually don't need to wait for that to happen. Our research has found that when teachers have the support of subject matter experts, whether they be local emergency management staff or volunteers, research scientists or Indigenous knowledge holders, they're able to integrate DRR into so many strands of the formal curriculum. And teachers we've worked with at Anglesey, Strethview and Hackaway have consistently emphasised that DRR education provides them with opportunities to teach core curriculum content in meaningful and purposeful ways that really engage students and promote high levels of student achievement. So going forward, a major focus for us and our agency partners is to find scalable, sustainable mechanisms of DRR education that actually supported by school community partnerships, because teachers know the curriculum and emergency managers, so emergency management staff and volunteers, they know DRR. And it's our experience when these two parties join forces to design and deliver critical place-based DRR education, a whole lot of curriculum gets ticked off. Also, over the last few years, state education departments have begun to formally incorporate student voice, agency and leadership into their teaching and learning frameworks. And this provides really valuable opportunities for implementing critical place-based pedagogies for DRR. So for example, the Victorian Education Department's new framework for improving student outcomes includes student voice, agency and leadership as a core component. And that provides us with a very clear pathway for designing and implementing school-based programs that involve students as agents of change in line with the Sendai framework, and which really requires that critical place-based approach. Then we have school emergency management planning. And so in all states and territories, schools in hazard-prone areas are required to have emergency plans in place, and they are required to practice those plans. And this provides opportunities to embed DRR education in activities that schools are actually legally required to do. So a great example of involving children in school emergency management planning comes from Hackaway, where some of the children actually learned for their project what to do if it's too late to leave. So they learned all about the clothing that you need to wear if you need to stay in shelter in place during a bushfire emergency. And they actually recognised that their school uniform wasn't in any way appropriate for bushfire, polyester t-shirts and shorts that would provide very little protection. And so they actually recognised something that's been completely overlooked in guidance and planning templates for schools, you know, in every state and territory. So that's a really good example of how we can actually embed DRR education into school emergency management planning and the really significant benefits of that. And the final pathway is through action research. So as I noted earlier, research on DRR education has tended to rely on quantitative assessments of children's risk perceptions, their recognition and recall of key safety messages, and the completion of prescribed preparedness activities. This kind of research underestimates and misrepresents children's capacities for understanding risk and taking action to reduce risk in their own local context. We think that action research that involves students, teachers, and DRR practitioners as genuine stakeholders in projects that have transformative learning and action as the primary goal will enable the co-production of knowledge that can be used to inform the ongoing development and implementation of critical place-based approaches to DRR education. And I will finish up there, and I'll leave you with a quote from one of the mentors that I was lucky enough to have during my PhD, Alan Rhodes from the Victorian CFA, who taught me from a very early on that it's time government and agencies stop pretending that awareness raising campaigns and information dissemination will ever be sufficient or effective. And I hope that I've convinced you of that today and hopefully given you a few ideas of what we might be able to do to better involve children in DRR and design, you know, really, really good, engaging, rich, meaningful learning experience for children in their own communities. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we have some questions here. So who drives the collaborative work that enables children to participate so well? In each of the schools that I've conducted research in, it has involved community-based partnerships, so those school community partnerships. So in Anglesey, it's a partnership between the local CFA brigade and the school, but there are other local agencies involved in that partnership as well. So there is Parks Victoria, the local council, all of these different people who come in and contribute to the children's learning experiences in different ways. But what we find is that after the first year of this kind of programming, the external partners see it as so valuable in terms of their community engagement activities. So in Anglesey, for example, the Parks Victoria staff who help out on that program, running different learning activities and supporting the children with the development of their interactive presentations and workshops, they actually have that in their formal work plan. So I think what we see in the schools where, you know, these kinds of quite in-depth, intensive, critical place-based pedagogies have been really successful is there has been that partnership, but that partnership is sustained over time because the outcomes for the external partners are so valuable in terms of local, you know, increasing community safety at the local level, but also for the school because the teachers see that their students are just getting these really rich, meaningful learning experiences that have a really positive impact on the students' academic achievement, but also on their personal development. So I think that the collaborative work that enables children to participate so well is really where schools and community partners have shared goals, and that's what sustains that over time. So the next question is, how would you work with younger children and manage the fear about what they might experience? And I think this is where starting with that natural process is really valuable. So for younger children, learning about the role of fire in the environment, different plant and animal species and how they've become adapted to fire over time. And I think just really starting from that point where fire isn't something that is inherently bad or dangerous. And I think if we can start to introduce these environmental, that kind of real environmental education at that early age, by the time children do get to grade 5, 6, year 7, 8, they already have all of that understanding of bushfire in the environment. And then they can actually start thinking more seriously about hazards and disaster risk reduction. So I think that's a really nice way to introduce these concepts for younger people. I think the Indigenous fire stewardship side of things is really fantastic for younger children too. Being able to kind of start to introduce those ideas around, how Aboriginal approaches to fire and land management is a really great thing for younger children as well. And I think that's what I was saying too about, you don't need to start with the disaster and, the death and the destruction and everything else. You can actually start very gently with these kind of, with these concepts around, that the relationships between people and fire that aren't necessarily about death and destruction. I think that's really important. How do you think your findings can be applied within a broader approach to teaching children, primary and secondary, as well as adults in the broader community about the different risks associated with the inevitable impacts of hazard events associated with climate change in the future? And this is a really interesting question because it's only very recently that I've been doing research in schools that children have actually started to talk about climate change. And, to a large degree, that's a result of, student-led, child-led, youth-led activism, for action on climate change. Up until, 2 years ago, it was very rare for children in my research to talk about climate change as a factor that will be contributing to disaster risk. So I think we need to really start looking at how we're going to start bringing climate change into those discussions. We do know that there are a lot of children and young people out there dealing with climate anxiety and, real fear of what climate change is going to mean for them and their environment and their community and their safety. But I actually think that disaster risk reduction is one way that we can actually provide children with some agency with regards to how we adapt to climate change and cope with climate change, but also, to be able to give them the full picture of why it's so important that we actually, continue to demand more action on climate change, because the fact is that, extreme weather events are going to become more extreme, that are going to become more frequent, more intense. That's true of bushfire, flood, cyclone, severe storms. And so I think that, probably one of the next big things we really need to think about is how we're going to bring climate change into these discussions with children as part of these critical place-based pedagogies. And that's all the questions. Thank you very much. I hope that I've answered those sufficiently. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you would like any more information. And thank you very much again for having me. Thanks.